All right. Yeah, excited. I'm sitting down with Detective Jacob Duncan, who just recently moved over into our local sheriff's world. He was formerly with the Anderson Police Department. We worked together on a few occasions in the trafficking space. I've also got Sarah Murphy with us, who's the Deputy District Attorney here in Shasta County. Did I give your title correct, Sarah?
Senior Deputy District Attorney, but
Thank you. Thank you for adding the correct words in there. And yeah, these are two friends of mine. We get to work together in our anti-trafficking projects here and again. And they were kind enough to sit down with us as we're exploring the U.S. criminal justice system. How are you two? Thanks for being with us.
Good, good.
doing
Thanks for having
well.
us.
Nice. I'm really excited for this conversation. Just tell us what you're doing. We'll start with you, Jacob. Talk about your role within the criminal justice space.
Sure. So I'm still pretty young. I'm only 27, but I got into law enforcement when I was 21. I worked at the Anderson Police Department for about 6 years. Half that time was spent on patrol, and then the last half was in the detective realm. While I was in detectives is kind of when I found my element and kind of when I got the jive of what I like to do in the investigative world. I got really heavily involved in human trafficking from, some conferences I went to, a lot of work I did with Sarah, because Sarah is very passionate about that as well. And then, that kind of kicked off everything for me. I ended up getting involved as cross-sworn with the FBI, and I do a lot of work with them on the human trafficking side as well. So I've kind of had an area of expertise I really like to try and build for myself. But, Anderson's a very small fish tank. And so I decided to make a jump to a bigger fish tank. And I just started with the sheriff's office back in March. So
Nice. And just briefly, your motivation jumping into law enforcement land. What led you?
So I grew up in a military household. Sorry, cut your glance. I grew up in a military household. My stepdad was in the Marines, and so he always taught me that he didn't care what I did, but I had to be a contributing member of society.
Okay.
His phrase is always like, "You got to go flip burgers, you can, but you got to flip the best burgers." And so I always kind of modeled myself after those things, and always knew I was getting into public service. And so I was down in San Diego selling motorcycles when I was about 19, and started doing some ride-alongs, and it fit for me. It was something that was similar to the military, but I could still be at home and with my family and everything else. And so that's what kind of led me to get involved in it. And then I found my niche in the investigative world, and I haven't looked back since then. So
Nice. Sarah, yourself, what you're doing and what led you into that place?
So I am a senior deputy district attorney. I supervise the family violence unit at the Shasta County District Attorney's Office. And that unit is comprised of 4 people and myself. And we prosecute and handle all of the adult sexual assault cases, child sexual assault cases, domestic violence cases, elder abuse cases, physical child abuse cases, and stalking cases. I think I got them all. And then in addition to that, really large part of my assignment, I also carry a caseload of homicides. So I prosecute in our serious offender unit, which handles all of our murders, homicides that happen in Shasta County. So I stay pretty busy with that as well.
Yeah.
That's what I'm doing right now.
Yeah, you guys are both in a very intense space. How about for you, Sarah, just the motivation, like some of the initial draw into that, like making a decision to become a DA? I'm sure there's a process, but anything in your background that you want to share that, like, yeah, this is kind of what stirred me to move this way? Or
Yeah, so my bachelor's is in forestry and natural resources. I wanted to go into a very different type of law.
okay. Yeah.
But I needed a job after law school because I had a family member who was sick and had moved in with me. And so while I was waiting bar results, came to work at the DA's office here in Shasta County, and I just fell in love with the job.
Wow.
It's something new every single day. And that's not always a positive, right? It's not always a good new day, but it is something new every day, and it's just one of the most rewarding. And I have to say, like, there are days where I tell people I don't know that there is a more rewarding career
Wow.
and job than what I do, working and fighting for victims in our community.
Yeah, beautiful. So let's talk about the criminal justice system from your vantage point. Like, we don't want to do a college level course, but what do you guys, what do you love about the criminal justice system? What's working within the criminal justice system? I do also want to get into like, hey, what are challenges within the criminal justice system? Like things that, you're working in it, and you would also say, yeah, I think there's maybe a need for shift or reform. But let's start on the positive. Like what are you guys seeing that is working? You just mentioned, Sarah, I'm working with victims, and that sounds like a big motivator for you. Like you're helping people that in some way have been wronged.
Yeah, it's funny, Lance, you asked like to start with the positive, because the positive is always the hardest thing for people to start with, at least in my world.
Okay.
My world is so hard. But I feel like it actually, when you are able to turn the work that I do and the work that I get to do working with Jake into a positive, it's really amazing. I mean, my job every day is to empower my coworkers to go out there and give victims in our community a voice, to help victims, the most vulnerable victims in our community, right? Our kids, our elderly, our victims who are in domestic violence and stalking situations, or who have had their life taken from them. We give them a voice. We are the people who can stand up, and we have the backbone and the shoulders to stand up in court when they may not be ready to like use that voice. And we get to give them a voice, right? We get to be the person that empowers them through the process. And it's really motivating to look at it in that positive way versus the negative of like, oh my gosh, this job is just so hard. It is, but there's something just truly rewarding about taking a person who has to report potentially the worst thing that's ever happened to them in their life and entrust it into hands of perfect strangers. And you get that, you feel the weight of that, and then to go into a courtroom and be able to stand up and advocate for justice for them, and advocate for justice for our community, and advocate, for justice. I mean, even for myself, I'm a member of our community. And so that is that's a truly positive piece of this job.
That's good. I love it. Jacob?
Yeah, so I feel like going from being a patrol cop to becoming a detective offers kind of a unique perspective on that. When you're on patrol, you think you are the law. You go and you arrest people and they go to jail, and you're empowered, and you kind of live in your own little world when you're first a new cop, because you think that the law encompasses you and what you do every day. And then when you get into detectives is really when you find the positives, and you see how awesome our justice system is, because it's such a well-oiled machine, and it's easy to focus on the negatives, but most of the time our justice system works. And when you get in, you get to start working with the district attorneys, and you get to actually start working with them to prosecute cases, and you get to go to trial, and you get to work with those victims, and you get to see like all the different elements that it takes to actually criminally convict somebody. You learn to not only appreciate the work that people do, on our side of it, on the prosecution side, but also like on the defense side. And, you form good relationships with also a lot of the defense attorneys and things like that. And you gain a mutual respect for both sides of the law, the equal sides of justice. And that's really where you learn to appreciate and see the positives of our justice system. Like we created that, our society created this justice system where you have to go through these procedures, be convicted of a law. And it's a great thing to be a part of, really. And that's just we all love working with the victims, and Sarah does a phenomenal job with that. So offering kind of, for me, just something unique that I can see, for myself is going from that transition of being a very isolated patrol cop, and then, being a detective, being able to appreciate more of, what the law and justice really looks like.
Yeah, and back to the statement you were leading with, Sarah, to represent victims. I mean, it's a really big idea that people in our communities are potentially being taken advantage of, exploited in whatever way, violence perpetrated against them, and that there is somebody that can stand up for them. It's a really big deal that there is accountability when people are crossing lines that end up hurting others. It's a very big subject. And if there wasn't protection out there, that's a scary thought, right? There aren't people like you doing the jobs that you're doing. That's actually a really scary thought. Like, are our
A lot of
community
people
safe?
forget about the district attorneys, and what they actually do on that side of it, because, you see the cops and you just see, everything else, but you don't see how much the DAs actually put in on that side of the law, which it's a pretty neat thing to be able to be part of and to see.
Yeah, yeah, it's big. So, and I do want to say, just because I've had the privilege of working with you guys, the way that you represent victims is really refreshing. Um, yeah, you're not just robots. Yeah, neither one of you are just robots. You actually really care about people, and yeah, that's refreshing. I'm sure there's a lot of people in your shoes that are not robots, but I have the privilege of being able to work with you guys a bit. Um, can you guys talk a little bit about maybe some of the challenges that you face, like things that make it hard for you to get your job done? And what I mean by that is, like you're on the other side of the counter, and maybe you're helping some people that don't live where you live to see, actually, there are some challenges, whether it's red tape type challenges or whether it's just inherent challenges of, the job. um, Again, hoping to like help like normal people's eyes open to maybe some of the things that you guys have to navigate. Could be law based. There could be laws that are really challenge make your job hard, or it could just be system stuff. And also, yeah, let's just stay there. So, Sarah, you
Let's
want to
just
start?
stay there. The whole realm, right?
Uh-huh.
Jacob, you want to
Sarah
start
could
on this?
probably spend the entire session on this. What'd you say?
You want to start on this one?
Jacob,
Sure. So
go
I
first.
would I would I would say that for me, biggest frustrations that we deal with right now is all the reform we see in juvenile law.
Okay.
Juvenile law is really hard to work with, especially when it comes to interviews, and because they put so much study and emphasis into juveniles, and they have all these big ideas of what's the best thing to do to be able to protect the kids, even offender kids, and they really affects our job and how we can get our job done.
Okay.
So I would say that's, and then not only that, we just have a lot of juvenile offenders, and we have a lot of variety of juvenile crimes. So like human trafficking specifically, we see a ton of younger offenders and younger victims too. So our homicides as well. I mean, Shasta County, a lot of our homicides have been, younger juvenile, maybe not necessarily juvenile offenders, but on the younger end of the spectrum. So I would say for me, the trend I noticed right now, that's probably one of the bigger ones, just all around. I mean, we obviously still have issues with mental health, drug addiction, all those as well.
Hmm.
I feel like in California, we're always going to have issues with laws regarding, drug use, and maybe improperly labeling mental health as some criminal things, and we're still trying to wrap around that and trying to get that figured out. We have some positive things going on in Shasta County, hopefully, that are going to help address that. One of which being the Life Center proposal, which I'm a huge advocate for, just because on the street you see a lot of mental health crisis that law enforcement is subjected to, that's in the DA's office is subjected to, that really is not either of our jobs. It's really something on the mental health side that
Sure.
needs to be dealt with, and we need to work on in Shasta County. But the decriminalization, I mean, obviously we see that throughout all of California, and I know that puts a lot of pressure on the DA's office, and then it puts the pressure, back on us. And then, everybody, if they don't have a good relationship with the DA's office, they're like, oh, why aren't they prosecuting these crimes? And
Yeah.
people just don't understand how limited we are in the law enforcement realm, and the prosecution side, and that how many hardworking people are out there that are trying to make that happen. But we're fighting that of battle with California and the laws as well.
So decriminalization being, like, talk about that, Sarah.
Yeah, so I was actually just thinking, for example, in one of my homicide cases, recently the legislature changed the laws around parole. And for example, with a youthful offender, so someone who was under the age of 26 at the time they committed the offense, there's, if they're sentenced to certain life terms or they're sentenced to really long sentences, the legislature has made it so that the sentence that they're given, if they're given 25 to life or they're given 45 to life or whatever that sentence is, doesn't really mean that anymore. It's not a hard and fast, if you got sentenced to 25 to life, you're going to spend 25 years before you're eligible for parole. That's what 25 to life means, is 25 years before you're eligible for parole. And the legislature has done away with that and said, for some of these people, if you're under 26, then you've served 20 years in custody, then you become eligible for parole. Or on the flip side, we have elder parole, which now the state considers anyone age 50 or older in CDCR, so in prison, to be an elder, which that blows my mind, right? We have people who are still employed and can't retire till they're 57, 65, 72, but yet inmates are considered elderly at 50. And if you're elderly at 50 and you've served 20 years of your sentence, then you're eligible for release and parole. And so, for example, in homicide cases, right? I mean, I have cases where I have heinous crimes, and 20 years of someone serving in may only be that they get out at 52, or they become eligible to be out in 52 or 53 years old. So as I'm talking to a victim's family, and the victim's family has gone through this horrible tragedy, and they're totally reasonable saying, gosh, I think this person should spend 40 years in prison, and they have good reasons for it, right? They think they should be in there because then they're going to be, almost 70 years old or whatever, right? And their drug addictions will have dissipated by then. And I mean, they have all these like really reasonable reasons. As a prosecutor, I can't just negotiate for a sentence that looks like that anymore, because the legislature has said to us, well, we don't really care about the sentences you're negotiating. We're going to make these rules because we're going to release people from custody and we want them out. And this is the way to do it. I mean, that's just one example, and it's an extreme one when it comes to like looking at those really long sentences. And there are some people who would say, gosh, anybody who serves 20 years in prison, that's plenty, they should get out. But when you're a prosecutor or a police officer or a family member of a victim who has been, you name it, and it's a brutal crime, and they are being sentenced to a life sentence 20, 30 years before they should be eligible for parole, you've just taken that away. And that's just one example of the laws that we're struggling with. And it's not like one law, Lance. It is like every January, 25 new laws are enacted that you have to know how to like operate with day one. And they affect things drastically. I mean, and a lot of it is like stuff that is hard to describe to an average citizen or the public because it's really nuanced. But when you sit down as a prosecutor or a police officer and you're talking to a victim's family, you're like, well, here's the down and dirty, this guy's going to be eligible to get out in 20 years, or this that used to be a crime isn't a crime anymore. And those conversations, people go, wait, what do you mean you can't just, why can't we negotiate for this or what? So that becomes a really difficult thing to navigate, is the constant changing of the laws, which sometimes makes sense. Decriminalizing certain aspects with youthful kids, like actual minors, makes sense in some avenues. Other times you just look at it and you kind of go, I don't know how this makes sense. I don't know how this helps anyone other than people committing the crimes. And that's really hard. The other piece, I think, too, that the challenge we operate in all of the time is, so let's say our officers put together really great cases, right? And they're sending us cases that we file and we believe beyond a reasonable doubt we can prove them, because I don't file and my colleagues don't file a case unless we believe beyond a reasonable doubt that we can prove this case at trial. You get into your courtroom and you now are dealing with not just the laws, but you're dealing with society's influences on jurors and like what society is saying. And so, for example, the Me Too movement had a really significant push in one area, but for some of your jurors who don't view things the same way that individuals might in that Me Too movement, it was actually a backlash. And it was like, whoa, as a prosecutor, we had to be prepared to talk about national trends and the national media and what's happening in New York City or in Miami or in Los Angeles that's way outside of our wheelhouse and our like small community, because social media and the national media, like that influence is so significant at a ground level. So there's challenges, like Jacob said, I could talk all day, like, because it's just so many different challenges that we face. And it's not that we're not like, up to dealing with them, but it becomes weary when, every year we're going to get a whole onslaught of new laws that are coming in that you have to figure out how to navigate and still provide justice and make our community a safer place.
And I'm assuming when I make this statement that trend and that swing is towards the idea of restorative justice, where, those that are getting penalties or being held accountable for their crimes, there is that, that window, that opportunity for them to quote unquote change, come out of prison better than when they went in. But I also know there's more to it than that, right?
Yeah, and I think that the idea of restorative justice is probably a piece of that puzzle.
Yeah.
But when we talk about restorative justice, like that itself is such a loaded term, because I think that defining what restorative justice is significant. I mean, I visited a group of lifer inmates at San Quentin, and most of them are never going to get out. And they had some of the most amazing restorative justice programs ever. And by that, I mean, the offenders are taking accountability for their action. Yeah. They are doing things to restore the victim's family. They're even as simple as the inmates were using the victim's name. We were in a very small setting. Yep. And as a prosecutor, I got this opportunity to go to this like clinic thing that was happening, but they were using the victims' names, right? Like, and humanizing people who they had done horrible things to. And that was absolutely amazing. Yep. But San Quentin is one of the few prisons that has restorative justice programs like that. And it's comical in my mind, because they're for people who are likely never going to get out. Yeah. Whereas we have all of these other prisons where the programming, the restorative justice programs, they're not being funded in the same way. They're not being encouraged in the same way. So you have individuals coming out who are like, I'm getting out, right? Like, and I'm going to go back into our society. And we don't have systems, structures in place to help make sure that they have secure housing, to make sure they have jobs, to make sure that they're not going back into, drug fueled crime sprees and the rest of it. So there's this idea that like, oh, this is maybe good for restorative justice, without then actually saying, what is restorative justice to us? And are we funding that? And that's something that is like, these laws change and then we sort of just forget about the consequences.
Yeah, I love what you're saying. To me, that would be the definition of restorative justice. Like, you're being very clear. There's still accountability. It's not a passe. It's not a like sweeping things under the carpet. And it acknowledges like, okay, there's still a human life on both sides of the equation. The victim and the offender are humans, and there's a need for change. I like the thought of when someone's incarcerated, held accountable for their poor actions, that there's going to be recompense. But I also like the idea of there's still a future for that offender, or an opportunity for a future. but you're right. I think sometimes the terms are loose. People aren't defining terms. There aren't real outcomes. Um, what are your thoughts though, or what have you seen personally? You mentioned San Quentin. Are there some things that you see are positive trends with some programs being adopted, um, which may not be your job, but it sounds like that's probably someone else's role in the community, probably parole and otherwise. Do you see anything that feels like, it's moving in a positive direction where people might be getting healed up and getting better?
I think that the idea that we have created in Shasta County and across the state, many counties have specialized courts so
Yeah,
that we have, like, for example, mental health court. We call it behavioral health court here, where you have individuals who have diagnosed mental illnesses
yeah,
that are directly connected to their crimes, helping them to find a way to manage their mental health, manage behavioral health issues, providing them stable housing, providing them with guidance. Like, that's one example. We have an addicted offender court here, which is, well, it's supposed to be for those individuals who are addicted to some type of, drug or alcohol. Typically it's drugs, and they go through the same sort of hand-holding process, right? And in that court, we recognize people are going to slip up and they're going to make mistakes, and we give them opportunities. Those types of programs directly overseen by the court, where you have all parties involved, I think are phenomenal.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think that you have people who are graduating from some of those programs and they're doing really well in our community.
Yeah.
I know though that, like, for addicted offender issues, when the state changed the laws on sentencing for certain offenses like possession and made them just misdemeanors, the kind of hammer that used to be there for some of these individuals, that carrot at the end of, like, you're not going to go to prison if you do this well, has been gone. And so you've seen a shift in individuals in those programs, because now you're getting more drug dealers in those programs who trying to restore a drug dealer who is wreaking havoc in our community versus someone who's addicted. It is a very different thing.
Wow.
So I think that those court programs, though, really are amazing. There are some other programs that I don't think are nearly as effective because they're not overseen in the same way. They're run by one of the justice partners, and that's it. And
Yeah.
And then you find stuff out about it, and you're like, wait a minute, that doesn't seem like it's actually helping our community in that way. But those tend to be programs where you don't have all the partners involved or sitting at a table or, watching people go through the program and going, gosh, this is working really well, or man, this is not working at all.
Yeah, it's like taking away accountability isn't going to produce results. Like,
right.
There's got to be that recompense dynamic, and hey, there will be a consequence, right? But again, the hope of something restorative alongside recompense, accountability, or hard time, I love it. To me, that sounds more like a full picture. And that, in your guys' opinion, that does feel like, I'm making a statement. Would you agree with this statement that there has been some positive shifts within the criminal justice system in that sense, where it's no longer purely punitive, but there is an acknowledgement of, restorative practices within accountability is valued? Would you say that generally is a true statement, or?
I think so. I think that like everything, the pendulum swings, and I think that we're swinging a little bit too far on that side of it. And like Sarah spent this entire time talking about is balance.
Yeah.
And so I think as a state and the justice system, we're still trying to find that balance of what we should be doing, what we shouldn't. Obviously, we've erred away from the side of accountability so much, and I'm hoping that we can kind of dial it back in more of the balance side of it. As a state level, on a county level, I think that Sarah touched on a lot of it, that people here value enforcement, they value accountability, and I think that Shasta County could use more programs on the side of restorative, at least available to people that are getting out and having things like that. So I think it's interesting because on a state side, I think, the law is erring more on the side of restorative and accountability, but on a county side, like we don't have enough restorative practices in place, outside of the court system to help people out that really, deserve that restorative justice.
Okay. That's cool. That's good insight. And what I hear you guys saying is at a state level, it's almost like it's hard to hold people accountable because the laws are making it just easy for people to commit crimes.
And I think it's more of the quality of life crimes than anything else.
Okay.
Sarah obviously has more insight on that, but you see a lot of the quality of life crimes are where you're lacking that accountability.
Which would be, for instance,
petty theft,
okay.
The drug crimes, the different things that are going to affect the way your community looks,
okay.
Different various things like that.
Yeah, I think there's definitely sort of two different things happening, right? There's this idea that we're going to decriminalize the low level offenders. So your drug offenders and your people who are just stealing stuff from Safeway and, just that piece of it versus all of the structural changes that have happened to the law for people who are sentenced to prison. So there is also all sorts of things affecting early releases that are not elder or youth, but are individuals who you go in for 10 years, but if the base term you went in on was only 2, you may be released at 1, right? Like, so you look at stuff like that and those can be on things like domestic violence crimes, which that drastically affects our communities because when an offender is in a home, you're increasing the adverse childhood experiences for kids, you're increasing law enforcement responses, you're increasing potentially medical responses, and then you have the whole court system that comes after. So the state hasn't figured out what it wants to do in any effective way because it tells us things
That's
but doesn't fully fund them, and wants to hold certain people accountable and say they're holding people accountable, but then when you hold them accountable by sending them to prison, they get released with like a slap on the hand. And I'm not saying that prison is an easy place to go because I don't ever want to go there outside of my capacity and work, right? But what I'm saying is, there are some people who we say, your conduct is so bad, you need a timeout from society. You don't get to beat your wife anymore or hurt your children or drive around drunk so many times in our community that you cause a collision, right? Like those are the types of things where then we're like, okay, you need to go have a timeout. But if we negotiated for a 10-year timeout and you only serve 1 year of it, what does that actually then say? Yeah. Right. So, yeah.
Well, it says you can go ahead and get back up to that terrible activity really quick. That's not restoration. That's not healing. That's not changing the situation.
I mean, that's not even giving a victim in a domestic violence time enough to stabilize their life and figure out what on earth their life looks like while that offender is gone.
Yeah. That's disconcerting. That's got to be really challenging for you guys to have to navigate.
Let's go back to the positives, Lance, please, because the negatives can go all the time.
Yeah,
that's true.
Well, you're right. And that's partly why we're doing these conversations is so like, oh, okay, there's actually more going on than meets the eye, and which is a positive. It's a positive for us to learn and kind of have a sense of what you guys are navigating.
I don't know what your what the scope of your audience is for these, Lance, but I think we have good ideas coming up in Shasta County. I think we have the right people trying to do the right things, and I think you'll see more of that balance here. Because most of the people here want to see bad guys go to jail. Most people want to see bad guys stay in jail, and so sometimes it's hard to see past the surface and see what it really takes to keep people off the streets and committing crimes. But I think we'll see an upward trend of that here in Shasta County. So
yeah, it's good. It's great. Well, yeah, really insightful. Really appreciate your time. Anything else you'd want to bring up or share as we're getting close to wrapping up?
I think, Lance, that there is I think there's I think there's a couple of like pieces for the criminal justice system in our community specifically, is that the DA's office is a reactive agency, a lot like law enforcement is. Like, we're responding to a police report that comes in of a crime.
Okay.
One of the things that we try to do here, and I know our justice partners try to do, is get out in our community, get out in our schools, and try to be proactive in the prevention world.
Yeah.
And that is something that, gosh, I wish that I had more time to do. And I know that my colleagues do too, but that is a real piece of like getting out there and showing what prosecutors do, what police officers do in a positive way, because a lot of times we're the negative people come into contact with us when something bad has happened. But also just educating our kids on what that looks like for, trying to stay out of trouble and making better choices. And so that's something that I think in our community, I don't know that it's unique to our community, but it's a really kind of cool piece of what the DA's office and law enforcement do in connection with other groups, including health and human services and nonprofits in our town. Is really getting out there and talking to kids. That is, ultimately how we continue to maybe shape our criminal justice system going forward. Trying to keep people from coming into it, I think, is a big part of it, both on the offender side, but also on those being victimized. So that's something that I think is really just a cool piece of what we do here.
Yeah. It's great.
I think Sarah touched on like the education component is huge. I mean, community education is one of the biggest things that I've seen, is ordinarily is lacking, especially here in Shasta County. And I'll self-admittedly say that, I in the recent years have grown in that area. But like I'm part of Leadership Reading, which is, an organization with a bunch of figureheads from different places that come and do leadership classes. But the coolest thing about that course is you have all these different people from different businesses and agencies, and you get to learn about your community. And I've grown up here in Shasta County, and I've learned so much about the various different, historical components, arts and culture, things I've never known about. And if I could say anything about, that leadership reading class, is just community education is huge. Like, I didn't know about half the resources available to, the homeless population. And I work in law enforcement. I didn't know a lot about the mental health services, and I deal with them all the time. So going out and just having that conversation with different professionals, that you work with, I think is huge. So I would encourage anybody that's interested in the justice system to also go and have a conversation with the people that are involved in it, just as Sarah said, and educate themselves so they have a better idea of what it's like. Because even on my side, when I was like a patrol officer, we all want bad guys to go to jail, stay in jail. We want more jail space. But until you get a bigger picture and you see what it actually takes to keep people off the streets and to actually rehabilitate, seeing what that whole picture looks like, you don't really have an idea until you have that conversation. So
yeah,
community education.
Maybe ending there, like with recidivism rates, there's complexities, right? Like people committing crimes, getting out, committing crimes, just back and forth. What are your guys' thoughts on, the holistic transformation of an individual? So someone, you're saying a bad guy, they're held accountable, they're in prison, but they get let out. What's that process look like for them to stay out from your guys' vantage point?
If they haven't been taught the life skills that help them make better choices, many of them are just going to end up committing the same crimes again. I mean, and I'm talking about things like your theft crimes, your breaking into houses crimes, your drug crimes. I mean, that's one like aspect, is like, if someone doesn't know a different path, they're going to go back to what is comfortable and easy or easier. And then I think there's recidivism in some ways that society believes that we can change certain people. And I don't know that the data actually says that. I think it's a really hopeful human thing. Like, hey, we can change this person. and I'm talking about certain domestic violence crimes, certain sexual assault crimes, like some of those people are not as willing or open to be able to be changed. And so I think recidivism in and of itself is, I think all of these words we use have to be really well defined, and you have to talk about which category, because recidivism with someone who commits breaking into houses or stealing cars is way different than someone who is a serial, like, you know, rapist, right? Or somebody who is committing domestic violence crimes and they go from victim to victim to victim. And I think that it becomes a moving sort of target as to, can you provide a new choice for somebody who is committing crimes because they are homeless or don't have some sort of funding source or are drug addicted and they have to get their next fix, so they're going to do whatever they can, versus someone who makes the choice to batter their wife or ignore what consent is, right? Like that's a very different thing. And we don't separate as a society talking about recidivism that way. We just sort of lump it into like, well, what are the rates of reoffense? Well, you tell me. And also to note that the data when it comes to rates of reoffense or data in general, especially when it comes to person crimes, are so underreported, because you're depending on victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, elder abuse to report. And the numbers on that tell us across the board that all of those crimes are underreported by, I mean, just so high that they're underreported versus people who call and say, gosh, my car got broken into, right? And like, so we don't even have a good gauge on really how underreported those numbers are. So we don't have a good gauge on the rates of reoffense for people crimes, I think, versus like these property and or quality of life crimes.
Very, very insightful. That's really insightful. Anything from you on that, Jacob?
Sarah, obviously just elaborates on that really well. I feel like every time you have us on, anything to talk, we're always the Debbie Downers, because you want to talk about, how great people are and the hope that they have to change. And I'm a huge believer that, people can change if they want to and things like that. But, my honest opinion is similar to hers, where there's like, there's some people who are just broken people. And, the purpose of incarceration, one of them is, incapacitation, is to keep them from coming back into society. And, they're the wolves that are coming to attack the sheep that we have out here. And it's our job to make sure that they stay incapacitated so they can't. But the programs, the people who do need it, it's our duty, to also respect that and to develop the programs that can make them successful in life and to get them back out there. Because ultimately my job gets easier and Sarah's job gets easier when people are rehabilitated and they're not reoffending. So we're on the same page where, we want people we can, to change. But the people who can't, they deserve every ounce of the law to keep them, where they're at.
Absolutely.
So, but you see big ideas like the Life Center that, hopefully will come to fruition. That's something that's a more rounded approach to a new idea to try and have accountability, but also restorative justice to try and get people the resources they need to become contributing members of society. Again, that's hopeful for Shasta County. So
great. Well, Jacob, Sarah, thank you guys so much. I know you're really busy. Appreciate you guys spending time with us. And yeah, I feel like this is very informative, inspiring, and I'm hoping those that take part with us or listening are getting some good information. So appreciate your time. You guys have a great rest of your day, and I'm going to say adios with that. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, Sarah.
Bye.